Welcome back, Gadgeteers. Today we're going to talk about a fairly serious topic. It involves a piece of malware that was actually developed by a Russian group called Fancy Bear. Now, there are some reports that this particular hacking group is actually associated with the Russian government, but they've created a piece of malware called VPNFilter, and some of you asked me to speak about this particular nasty piece of malware. So here's what's going on. Essentially, some of our home routers and other devices, small office, home office type routers, have been infected with this malware. The FBI knows of at least 500,000 devices that have been infected, and if you look at the malware and its design, the way it's created, there's actually 3 stages. Now, the first stage, which they're calling stage 1, basically infects the router, and unfortunately this particular stage is what they call persistent malware, meaning even if you reboot, the malware will still be present on your router. However, stage 2 and stage 3, which have the actual payload, those are the ones that are really bad, and those are what's called ephemeral, meaning that if you reboot your router, they go away. Now, there may be some ways to get that stage 1 malware completely off of your router, and we'll discuss that in a minute. But before we do that, let's talk about the design of the malware and how it works. So in stage 1, what happens to your IoT device, aka your router, is that the malware will infect it, and when it does this, it actually sets up a small package on your router and becomes resident in memory. And the type of memory that it's affecting is called NVRAM, or non-volatile RAM. So as you can imagine, if the router reboots, it's still there. The program starts up once again. And what that program tries to do, and this is kind of a sloppy design, the first thing it tries to do is connect to photobucket.com, and there's a list of accounts, maybe 10 or 20. Now these are fake accounts that go to one of these 10 or 20 fake accounts and try to download an image to your router. In that image, in the metadata about the image, is some critical information, and namely the IP address of a server that the system will connect to. When I say system, I mean your router. Your router will connect to, and what it'll do is try to download the payload for step 2. Now, the reason that the router tries to contact this server for step 2 is so that the payload can be modified and changed if they want to attack, say, a different service or servers or a protocol used for the electrical grid, which is exactly one of the things that they're trying to do. So what the FBI did was seize all of those accounts and put a dummy payload on there that actually will do no harm to your router, but it will allow the FBI to at least identify infected routers and notify ISPs of that. Now, they did get a court order allowing them to do that, and the only thing they can do is record the IP information of the router and provide it to the ISP in the hopes that the ISP can then notify the user. If the malware is unable to contact PhotoBucket and log into one of those accounts, it then goes to a backup server on the web domain called toknowall.com, ironically. So just like before on PhotoBucket, the malware will attempt to find a server where it will go to grab this payload for stage 2. But the domain toknowall.com has been seized by the FBI, so just as before with PhotoBucket, your router will be unable to find the server in that picture using that metadata to go and download stage 2. So if your router did get infected and did get to the point where it downloaded a valid stage 2 package, it's moved on to stage 3. And stage 3 is where it starts doing some work. One of the big things it does, as you can imagine, is monitor all traffic going in and out of the router, recording details, information about payments or banking or any private or personal information that might be useful. The second thing it does is whatever orders it's received in that stage 2 payload, which might be to attack a service or attack a server or cluster of servers, or to attack an infrastructure service like, for example, the electrical grid. Now, 500,000 routers is quite a bit. How would they attack the electrical grid? Well, as you can imagine, the electrical grid does have some communications on the internet, and there are some protocols that they're using, according to this article I've read, that could be used to attempt to attack the electrical grid. I personally don't feel it would be effective, but I haven't looked at all the information yet, so I don't want to say nothing would happen. But considering that the FBI has now seized the critical domain that's involved in the attacks and has also taken down those bogus accounts on photobucket.com, there's no further possibility of infection or communication with the bad guys. There is a third method, however, that hacking group can use to communicate with infected routers, and that's direct. But they would have to have the IPs, which they may have, in which case they could communicate directly with the routers. And there's one last thing that this group could do, which is disable the routers completely and brick them, which would mean, of course, you would be out of router. I'm thinking they probably won't do that unless they would want to cover their tracks, but it's pretty clear that everybody knows who's done this, especially the FBI. So I think at this point, bricking them, the routers, really wouldn't do them any favors. So let's get right down to the nitty-gritty. What can you do to protect yourself? Well, number one, I'm going to put some URLs down in the description. One, check and see if your router is one of those that is known to be infectable. That doesn't mean it has been infected. That's one thing you want to do. Number two, and actually I should say number one, the first thing you should do is reboot your router. Then check and see if yours is one of those routers that is infectable. Number three, update the firmware on your router. Now, this isn't overly complicated under normal circumstances. In the case of my router, which is an EA6900 from Cisco, but really Linksys, which is one of the possible routers that could be infected, although it's not on the list, it still could be infected. That's one important thing to consider, is that even if your router isn't on the list, it could be infectable by this malware. So reboot your router, check and see if it's on the list of routers that's infected. Go into the admin website for your router, which is usually the initial private IP address on your network, and try to download the latest firmware, which again, it's not too awfully difficult, and allow the router to reboot itself again to install the latest firmware. Is that a guarantee that you're not infected? No. Is it easy to get rid of the infection in the event that you have stage 1? It all depends on which router you have and what type of firmware you load. There is some firmware out there that you can download that's open source that you can use on certain routers, but this is far beyond the scope of what we're talking about in this video. Downloading open source firmware and installing it on your router, if you don't do it correctly, could brick your router, and I definitely don't want you to be in that situation where you lose all functionality of your router. So do those first 3 steps we talked about, and hopefully after that you'll be okay. At the very least, stage 2 and stage 3 are no longer possible because of what the FBI has done to block any further infection. And if your device is infected, you're going to end up getting a communication in one way or another from your ISP. So keep an eye out for that. I know that many ISPs, when you sign up, automatically give you an email address with their domain name, Comcast.com for example. And if you don't check that email, you may never know if you have any important communication coming from Comcast or whatever ISP you're with. You can change the administrative email, which is what I did with Comcast, so when there's something urgent they need to contact me with, it actually goes to my Google email address right away, so I know if something's up. One of the big things that I keep an eye out for is when I'm getting close to running out of my 1 terabyte cap that I have per month. So that's one way that you can keep track of activity or important communications from your ISP. So the big difference with this particular malware is it can be persistent after reboots, which is very rare, but I think we're going to see more of this type of malware as time goes on. It just underscores how vulnerable IoT devices really are and how easy it is to infect them, and if they don't have any protection by, say, an intrusion prevention system or a more advanced router like commercial routers or some type of firewall, basically this router can be infected and you may never even know that it's infected. Something to consider. I hope you will reboot your router at the very least. That's the smallest thing you could do, but you really should update the firmware on your router and do a check, see if it's on the list. The list isn't too big, just so you know. However, that doesn't mean that your router is not one that can be infected. Keep that in mind. The research is ongoing on this particular nasty malware. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, hit like and subscribe. If you didn't like it, I think you already know what to do. Drop me a comment, let me know what you think, and above all, stay secure. See you next time on Fast Gadgets. This video was made possible with support from viewers like you. If you find this video useful, consider becoming a patron for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/fastgadgets.